Have you ever wondered what it feels like when the very people sworn to protect a nation suddenly become the accused? That is the question facing Mali today. Two of its most respected generals and more than 40 soldiers have been arrested, accused of plotting a coup. For a country already scarred by years of unrest, this moment feels like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure whether the ground will hold or give way. Good evening, friends. Imagine yourself in Bamako, Mali's capital, on a warm August night in 2025. Families gather in small courtyards sipping tea, the sound of distant motorcycles echoing through narrow streets. Yet tonight, there is no comfort in routine. The city whispers. Neighbors glance nervously at soldiers in the streets. Mothers wonder if their sons in uniform will come home or vanish behind military gates. For many, the arrests feel less like justice and more like a shadow creeping across daily life. To understand why this story matters, we must recall the recent history of Mali. Only a few years ago, in 2020 and again in 2021, coups toppled governments, bringing the current military leadership to power. Many citizens placed their hopes in promises of order, stability, and protection from jihadist insurgents that terrorize the countryside. But hope is fragile, and when generals themselves are accused of betrayal, the entire foundation of trust begins to crumble. This is not just another headline. It is a story about loyalty, fear, and the battle for the future of a nation at the heart of Africa's Sahel region. What happens in Mali does not stay in Mali. Instability here spreads across borders, to Burkina Faso, to Niger, to Côte d'Ivoire, shaping the lives of millions. And for Americans, it carries echoes of the Cold War. Superpowers circling, insurgents rising, civilians caught in the crossfire. Tonight, we will journey through the arrests, the fears, and the reactions shaking Mali. We will meet ordinary people, soldiers' families, frightened students, grieving mothers, whose lives are being torn apart by political games they never chose to play. And together, we will ask, is this the moment when Mali finds the strength to stand, or another chapter in a cycle of coups and broken promises? Stay with me, because the next few minutes may change the way you think about Africa's future and America's place in it. The morning of August 10th, 2025, began like any other in Bamako. Markets opened slowly, with vendors setting out baskets of tomatoes and dried fish. The air carried the usual mix of dust and smoke from small cooking fires. But by mid-morning, news spread like wildfire. General Abbas Dembélé, one of Mali's most respected commanders, had been taken into custody. Dembélé was not just another officer. He was a former governor of the central Mopti region, a man whose reputation stretched across military and civilian life. To many soldiers, he was a father figure. To farmers in Mopti, he was the general who helped coordinate relief when jihadists blocked trade routes. His sudden arrest shocked the ranks and sent ripples of fear through the countryside. Within hours, rumors multiplied. Some claimed he was under house arrest, others that he had been spirited away to a military compound on the edge of Bamako. Conflicting images appeared on social media, one showing him walking calmly into his home, another allegedly showing him surrounded by armed guards. No official explanation was given, only the government's statement that elements within the army had attempted to destabilize the state. And then came the second blow. Brigadier General Nima Sagara, one of Mali's few female generals and a pioneer in the Air Force, was also arrested. Her story struck a chord across the country. She was seen as a trailblazer, breaking barriers in a male-dominated institution. In villages where young girls rarely saw women in leadership, she had become a symbol of possibility. To hear that she had been accused of conspiracy left many in disbelief. Altogether, more than 40 soldiers were detained in the days that followed. Some were young recruits barely out of training, others seasoned officers with decades of service. Families gathered at checkpoints and military posts, begging for information. Wives brought food parcels that were refused at the gates. Children clutched photos of fathers they might never see again. Why now? Why these arrests? The government of Colonel Assimi Goïta, who himself seized power in a 2021 coup, claimed the measures were necessary to prevent a fresh attempt at overthrow. Officials pointed to intelligence reports suggesting that networks of discontent were growing inside the army. But skeptics argue the arrests were less about real conspiracies and more about tightening the grip of a regime that has already extended its mandate by 5 years, dissolved political parties, and silenced dissent. Consider the irony. In 2020, civilians poured into Bamako streets, demanding an end to corruption. They cheered when the military took over, believing a new era was at hand. In 2021, when Goïta consolidated power, Many accepted it as a painful but necessary step towards stability. Yet 4 years later, Malians watch as the same government accuses its own generals of treachery. Trust, once fragile, now teeters on collapse. The timing is no accident. In recent months, jihadist attacks have surged in the north and west of Mali. Villages have been raided, schools burned, farmers kidnapped for ransom. International allies note that as the army focuses inward, on political survival rather than battlefield defense, insurgents gain ground. Arresting generals in the midst of such violence feels, to many Malians, like turning swords inward while enemies circle outside. But behind these events are human lives that rarely make the headlines. One such life belongs to Mariam, the sister of a young soldier detained alongside General Dembélé. In an interview with a local journalist, her voice trembled as she described her last phone call with her brother. He had promised to return home for the Eid holiday, carrying small gifts for their children. Instead, soldiers came to the family's door, warning them not to ask questions. Mariam now visits a military base every morning, waiting for scraps of news, her children tugging at her dress. Another story is that of Awa, a university student in Bamako, who once admired General Sagara. Awa had hoped to join the Air Force herself, inspired by the sight of a woman in uniform commanding respect. When she heard of Sagara's arrest, she wept in class, her dreams suddenly fragile. If even she is accused, Awa asked, what chance do the rest of us have? They remind us that arrests on paper mean fear and broken futures in real homes. And yet, the government insists the actions are necessary. Officials argue that without decisive moves, Mali risks another cycle of coups that would plunge the country deeper into chaos. They highlight the need to root out disloyalty before it festers. But to many ordinary Malians, the sight of respected generals behind bars looks less like protection and more like paranoia. This is where the story sharpens into its central question. Are these arrests a genuine defense of national stability, or the latest move by a military government clinging to power? Stay with me, because the next chapter reveals how ordinary Malians are responding, and why their voices could shape the future of the entire Sahel. By the third day after the arrests, Bamako no longer felt like a bustling capital. It felt like a city holding its breath. Checkpoints sprang up across major intersections. Soldiers in armored vehicles patrolled streets that once belonged to taxi drivers and children walking to school. Conversations dropped to whispers in crowded markets. Rumors spread faster than the news. Some claimed that firing squads had already been prepared, others that the generals were negotiating behind closed doors. Fear became the daily currency. The turning point came when the government finally confirmed the names of those detained. The announcement landed like a thunderclap. Not only General Abbas Dembélé and Brigadier General Nima Sagara, but also dozens of officers spread across different units. To Malians, this was not just a purge, it was a message. No one, not even the most decorated figures, was beyond suspicion. The emotional impact was immediate. Families of soldiers gathered outside barracks, clutching placards, demanding information. Mothers knelt in the dust, begging guards to let them see their sons. Some women carried photographs of their loved ones high above their heads, silent protests against the silence of the state. The government, meanwhile, remained stern, insisting that any unrest would be treated as complicity in treason. For ordinary people, the confusion cut deep. They remembered too well the cycle of coups that had defined recent years. In 2020, the fall of a civilian president. In 2021, another coup inside a coup. And now, in 2025, whispers of yet another power struggle. To many, it felt as though the military that once promised salvation had become its own worst enemy. But what truly magnified the tension was the story of General Sagara. Her arrest resonated far beyond military circles. Radio hosts debated her case with a mix of disbelief and sorrow. Women's groups that had once celebrated her as a role model now spoke of betrayal or injustice, depending on where they stood. Some believed she was targeted because of her growing popularity, a symbol too powerful for the regime to tolerate. Others whispered that she had indeed spoken privately against the government's 5-year extension, and that was enough to seal her fate. On the streets, the reactions were divided. Supporters of the government rallied, waving flags and chanting slogans about national security. They accused the generals of plotting with foreign powers, though no evidence was shown. At the same time, quiet gatherings formed in neighborhoods where candles were lit for the disappeared. In those small circles, people shared stories, prayers, and the heavy silence of uncertainty. Outside Mali, reactions were equally tense. The African Union called an emergency session. its leaders expressing concern about an erosion of trust within the armed forces. In neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger, both under military juntas, officials voiced support for Mali's government, but privately worried the unrest could spill across borders. International media reported cautiously, often repeating the government's official line, but hinting at cracks within the army. For the United States and Europe, the arrests raised uncomfortable questions. Western nations had long partnered with Mali in counterterrorism efforts, funding training and supplying equipment. Now, they faced the possibility that those very forces were imploding. Analysts in Washington debated whether the arrests reflected necessary discipline or authoritarian overreach. Some warned that instability would create openings for extremist groups, forcing more American involvement. But the most powerful reactions came not from governments, but from individuals. A journalist in Bamako, speaking under anonymity, described the chilling effect of the arrests. "Every time I write a sentence, I wonder if it will be the one that gets me jailed." A shopkeeper near the Central Market said he no longer allows political discussions inside his stall, fearing informants. A school teacher in the North canceled history lessons about democracy, replacing them with neutral topics about geography. And yet, amid fear, defiance flickered. In one neighborhood, young men painted slogans on walls under cover of night. "We are not pawns." In another, women sang old resistance songs during evening gatherings, their voices soft but steady. These small acts did not make headlines, but they revealed something profound. Malians were not only afraid, they were also weary of silence. Visually, the climax could be captured in a single image. A line of mothers standing outside the Kati military base, holding candles that flickered against the darkness. They did not shout. They did not fight. They simply stood, waiting, a quiet indictment of a system that demanded their loyalty but offered no answers. The government insists these arrests are a necessary shield against chaos. But to the people of Mali, the arrests themselves feel like chaos embodied. The very institution that was supposed to protect them now appears fractured, suspicious, and unstable. And so, the nation waits. Will this purge end with trials and restored order? Or will it trigger another spiral of coups, counter-coups, and deeper unrest? Stay with me, because the next part of this story reveals how these events ripple far beyond Mali, shaping politics, society, and the fragile dream of democracy across the Sahel. When soldiers are arrested, it is not only uniforms that disappear. It is fathers, mothers, neighbors, and mentors. And when generals are accused of betrayal, it is not only their careers that crumble, it is the confidence of an entire people. Across Mali, the civil and political impact of these arrests has been immediate and heavy. Citizens now live in a climate of suspicion, where loyalty to the government is measured not by words, but by silence. Speaking too loudly, posting the wrong comment, or even attending a gathering can carry risks. Civil society organizations, once vibrant voices for reform, are retreating into the shadows. Activists describe a shrinking space, where meetings are monitored, leaders are harassed, and funding is quietly cut off. A well-known youth group that organized civic education campaigns has gone dormant, its offices locked, its members scattered. "We teach math now, not democracy," one former volunteer said bitterly. For ordinary families, the consequences are felt most deeply in daily routines. Parents warn their children not to mention politics at school. Friends avoid discussing the government over dinner. Markets, once noisy with debate, now echo mostly with the sound of bargaining for food. Fear has woven itself into the fabric of everyday life. Politically, the government of Colonel Assimi Goïta has tightened its hold. The 5-year extension of the military's mandate, approved earlier in 2025, effectively delays a return to civilian rule until at least 2030. By dissolving political parties and suspending opposition groups, the government has eliminated avenues for peaceful dissent. The arrests of generals reinforce this message. Those who challenge authority, whether in uniform or not, will be dealt with swiftly. But power consolidated is not always power secured. Beneath the surface, resentment simmers. Some soldiers whisper that the army has become more concerned with silencing its own than fighting jihadists. Civilians grumble that promises of security remain unfulfilled while freedoms vanish. The social contract, already fragile, teeters on the edge of collapse. The psychological toll is visible in the stories of individuals. In Bamako, Fatoumata, a mother of 3, now hides her husband's old political flyers in a wooden chest. She remembers when he proudly displayed them on the wall, believing change was possible. Now, she fears that even a forgotten paper could bring soldiers to her door. I want my children to grow up free, she says quietly, but I don't know if that is still possible. For him, the problem is not soldiers, but insurgents. When the army looks inward, the jihadists come, he explains. Already, militants have raided villages, taking livestock and burning granaries. Boubacar says he has lost count of the funerals in his community. For him, the arrests in Bamako are not distant politics. They are the reason he cannot sleep at night. These intertwined fears of the state and of insurgents create a society trapped between two threats. On one side, a government that demands obedience. On the other, extremists who thrive on chaos. The people of Mali, caught in the middle, struggle simply to survive. Beyond Mali, the political consequences ripple across the Sahel. Neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger, themselves governed by juntas, watch closely. Their leaders have echoed Goita's language about sovereignty and stability, but they also face similar pressures: insurgencies in rural areas, economic hardship, and restless militaries. If Mali falters, the fragile alliance among these countries could fracture. Internationally, Mali's credibility suffers. Negotiations with donors stall as foreign governments hesitate to invest in a country where generals are jailed without trial. Aid organizations find it harder to operate amid restrictions and suspicion. Meanwhile, Russia and other outside powers step into the vacuum, offering military support with fewer questions about governance. And yet, for all this repression, the spirit of resistance has not vanished. In small ways, Malians continue to assert their dignity. A teacher sneaks lessons on democratic history into her curriculum. A musician writes songs laced with coded criticism of the regime. A group of women organizes prayer circles, not openly political, but filled with quiet determination. These acts may seem small, but they echo a truth that governments often forget. People cannot be ruled by fear forever. History shows that suppression breeds its own backlash. The more voices are silenced, the more powerful the whispers of dissent become. The question now is whether Mali's rulers will recognize this before it is too late. Will they see the cracks widening beneath their grip? Or will they tighten control until the pressure erupts? This is the civil and political cost of the arrests. A nation that feels less like a home and more like a prison, where hope flickers but refuses to die. Stay with me, because in the next section, we will step outside Mali and ask, how do these events look through the eyes of the United States, Europe, and the wider world? And why should Americans, thousands of miles away, pay close attention to what happens in this landlocked nation of the Sahel? From Washington to Brussels, the news of Mali's arrests sparked immediate concern, but also quiet calculation. For the United States, Mali is not just another distant country. It is part of the Sahel, a region long described by Pentagon officials as the new front line against extremist groups. Over the past decade, American taxpayers have funded training, intelligence, and equipment for Mali's forces. Now, those same forces appear to be tearing themselves apart. The irony is not lost in Washington. Billions spent on stability, yet instability remains the only constant. U.S. officials worry about two key issues. First, counterterrorism. If Mali's army fractures, jihadist groups affiliated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda will exploit the chaos. Villages in the north and west are already under siege, and further weakness could allow extremists to carve out safe havens. For Americans who still remember 9/11, the thought of new sanctuaries for global terrorism is chilling. Second, great power competition. Russia has already established influence in the region through military contractors and arms deals. China, too, sees opportunity in infrastructure projects. Every step back by the U.S. risks leaving more room for these rivals. Analysts in Washington openly debate whether Mali will become a new testing ground, where the West and its competitors play out a familiar struggle for influence. In Europe, especially France, the developments are viewed with bitterness. After years of costly military engagement in Mali, Paris withdrew its troops in 2022 under pressure from local protests. Now, French diplomats watch uneasily as Mali deepens ties with Moscow. For Europe, instability in the Sahel also carries another fear: migration. Economic collapse and insecurity drive young men and families northward, toward the Mediterranean. Each new crisis in Mali raises the specter of waves of refugees reaching Europe's shores. The global reaction underscores a sobering truth. Mali's crisis is not confined to its borders. It is a fault line where local struggles intersect with international agendas. And in that collision, ordinary Malians often find themselves reduced to pawns. For Americans, the question is clear but difficult. Should the United States double down, trying to stabilize a fragile partner? Or should it step back, accepting that Mali is sliding beyond its influence? The answer is not yet written. What is certain is that the decisions made in Bamako will reverberate far beyond the Sahel, shaping security, migration, and geopolitics for years to come. Stay with me, because in our final section, we will look ahead. What might the next 3 to 6 months hold for Mali, and for Africa's broader struggle between hope and despair? The arrests of Mali's generals are not just about soldiers in uniform. They are a window into the fragility of a nation, and a reminder of how quickly trust can dissolve when power is built on fear. For the people of Mali, the future feels uncertain. Will their country continue down the path of repression with purges, silenced voices, and endless mandates? Or will a moment come when citizens demand change once more? No one can say with certainty, but history suggests that pressure cannot be bottled forever. The risks in the next 3 to 6 months are clear. Trials of the arrested generals may become showpieces, designed less for justice than for intimidation. Jihadist groups could step up attacks, exploiting an army distracted by internal divisions. Civil unrest may grow, with students, workers, and families reaching a breaking point. And internationally, Mali may drift further into the orbit of Russia and other powers, reshaping the balance of the Sahel. Yet there is also another possibility, one born not of governments, but of people. Across Bamako and beyond, small acts of resilience continue. Teachers finding ways to inspire students, mothers lighting candles